In 1902, a University of Pennsylvania expedition working the ruins of Nippur pulled a fragment from the dig that didn't fit anything else they'd recovered. The edges were clean. It had been stored deliberately, not buried in collapse. The text on it was not administrative, not a contract, not a star chart. It was a description of a place. Not a place in Mesopotamia, a place the tablet described in the same technical language the Sumerians used for everything else, as existing outside the movement of the sun, outside the counting of days, outside the thing the Sumerians themselves had invented and given to the rest of humanity. Outside time. The Sumerians invented time as we measure it. That is not a metaphor. Around 3000 BC, Sumerian astronomers created the base 60 system that gave us the 60-second minute, the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle. They tracked the movements of Venus to the day. They built calendars that predicted astronomical events years in advance. These were not people who thought loosely about time, which is what makes the fragment strange. Because the people who invented the measurement of time wrote down a description of a place where time, as they understood it, does not apply. The tablet is catalogued as CBS 14061 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. It was partially translated by Samuel Noah Kramer, the scholar who spent 4 decades reconstructing Sumerian literature from the thousands of tablets recovered at Nippur. What Kramer found in CBS 14061 and in 3 connected tablets from the same collection is a description of a realm the Sumerians called Dilmun. And what those tablets say about Dilmun is specific in a way that should be impossible, because it matches what thousands of people who have come close to death and come back describe with a consistency that modern researchers cannot explain. The place without time. The place where past and present and future exist simultaneously. The place where human beings have apparently been before. You need to understand what Dilmun is not before you can understand what it is. It is not heaven in the sense the word gets used later. The Sumerians didn't believe good people went somewhere better after death. Their texts describe the afterlife as Kur, a dark and dusty place where the bread tasted wrong and existence continued in diminished form. That is not a civilization constructing consoling fantasies. Dilmun is something else entirely. It exists in a different register of the Sumerian cosmological map. The tablets that describe Dilmun use a set of phrases that recur across multiple texts from multiple dig sites. These phrases are not poetic. They are descriptive. Technical. The raven does not croak in Dilmun. The sick-eyed man does not say I am sick-eyed. The old man does not say I am old. That list is not metaphor. When the Sumerians said the raven does not croak, they were describing an operational condition. The raven is present, but the process of croaking of one state becoming another state does not occur. What is being suspended across every item in that list is deterioration, the process that requires time in order to function. In Dilmun, the texts say there is no disease, no aging, no death, not because these things have been prevented, but because the conditions that make them possible do not exist there. The Sumerians were describing a place where the arrow of time does not point. 4 texts together build the complete picture. The first is the Enki and Ninhursag myth, one of the most completely preserved Sumerian literary compositions. When Enki arrives in Dilmun, the text describes what he finds before anything happens. A place that is clean. Pure, bright, the Sumerian word kug, untouched. Unchanged, the land before alteration. The second is the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian flood story. After the flood, a king named Ziusudra is transported to Dilmun and given eternal life there. The word used for life is not the ordinary Sumerian word for biological existence. It is Ziud-Sud life stretched beyond ordinary measurement, life that does not move toward its end the way biological life does. The third is a hymn to Dilmun reconstructed by the scholar Thorkild Jacobsen from fragments across 6 tablets. In this hymn, Dilmun is described as the place where the sun rises not geographically, but cosmologically, the place before the first dawn, the place that exists prior to the beginning of the solar cycle, the exact phrase used, before the counting. Before the counting is a Sumerian technical term. To say a place exists before the counting is to say it exists in a state prior to the conditions that make counting possible. And then there is the 4th text, the one that changes everything. CBS 14061, the clean-edged fragment from Nippur. Kramer published a partial translation of this text in 1944 and largely set it aside because it didn't fit his categories. It isn't a hymn. It isn't a myth. It reads like a report, written in first person. An unnamed individual describing an experience. 3 phrases repeat throughout. The first, where the breath does not move. The second, where the light has no edge. The third, and the one that matters most, where I knew all that was, all that is, and all that will be, at one time. This is not a description of prophecy. The Sumerians had specific vocabulary for prophecy. This is not it. This is a phenomenological description. A person describing the subjective quality of being in a place where past, present, and future are simultaneously accessible. Modern researchers who study near-death experiences have a specific term for this: the collapse of temporal sequence, and it is one of the most consistently reported features of the end across every culture ever documented. Near-death experience research as a formal discipline is 50 years old. The consistent features are well known: out-of-body, tunnel, light, peace, life, review, return. But there is one feature that gets the least attention because it is the hardest to explain. Not the distortion of time, the complete cessation of time as a meaningful structure. A 2024 paper in the journal Frontiers in Psychology found that altered time perception is reported in the majority of documented NDE cases, and that within this group, a significant subset described not the alteration of time, but its total absence. Respondents used phrases like, "There was no before and after. I existed in a permanent now. I could see everything that had ever happened to me and everything that was going to happen simultaneously, not one after another, all at once." A police officer who nearly bled to death described it to researcher Bruce Grayson. "I knew what it was like to experience eternity, where there was no time." How do you describe a state where nothing is progressing from one point to another, where it is all there, and you are totally immersed in it? An Air Force firefighter knocked unconscious by a fuel explosion. I was present at my own childhood and my own old age simultaneously, not as a memory, as a location I was in. These are not isolated reports. The consistency of this specific description across thousands of documented accounts from people with no shared culture and no prior knowledge of each other is what has driven researchers to take it seriously. The Sumerians wrote it down 4,000 years ago, where I knew all that was, all that is, and all that will be, at one time. Here is where the tablet stops being ancient literature and becomes something harder to categorize. The text of CBS 14061 is not describing a god's experience of Dilmun. The first-person voice is a human voice. The Sumerian grammar is unambiguous. The pronouns are mortal pronouns. A human being who has been there. And this is not the only instance. 4 times across the surviving Sumerian record, a human being is described in relation to Dilmun. When you align all 4 instances, a pattern emerges. Ziusudra is transported to Dilmun while still living. The text describes a moment of transition, a crossing in which he experiences what is described as the knowing of all things, before the gods settle him there permanently. Adapa, a sage created fully human by the god Enki, is summoned to the court of An. In the great above the realm, the tablets consistently locate adjacent to Dilmun. In the divine court, the text says, he saw the ways of heaven and earth. not the laws, the ways, the how, the mechanism. A human being standing in a place outside ordinary time, seeing the structure of the thing he had been living inside without knowing it was a structure. CBS 14061 describes a crossing, the timeless experience, and a return. The final passage reads, "I came back through the door, and I carried the shape of what I had seen, not in words, in the structure of how I see." These are not accounts of death and afterlife. These are accounts of living human beings crossing into a place outside time, experiencing total simultaneous perception, and returning permanently altered. The modern physics connection is not metaphorical, it is structural. The block universe model of space-time, which follows from Einstein's formulations and is taken seriously by a significant number of theoretical physicists, describes a universe in which past, present, and future all exist simultaneously as equally real states. What we experience as the flow of time is a feature of our particular position within the structure, not a feature of the structure itself. From outside the structure, all of it would be visible at once. Theoretical physicists who discuss what it would mean to exist outside the temporal structure use specific phrases: the eternal present, the timeless realm, the state in which sequence loses its grip. The Sumerians had one word for it, Dilmun, and they described the experience of being there in exactly the terms that modern near-death experience researchers document and that modern physics uses to describe existence outside time. Everything simultaneously present, no before, no after. Total perception of the structure from outside. The Sumerians were not describing a fantasy, they were describing a location. A specific, technically defined location with specific, technically described properties. And they were describing human beings who had reportedly accessed it. There is a second element of the Dilmun descriptions that connects directly to the Enki literature and that is harder to explain away than coincidence. In the Enki and Ninhursag text, when Dilmun is described, the text specifies two qualities of the sensory experience. The first, light is the dominant element, not sunlight. A light that exists before the sun rises. A light without source. The second, a quality the Sumerians called nigdim-dim-ma, the stillness before the first separation, the state before the division of things into distinct categories, before, and after, before dark and light, before living and dead. In Enki documentation, the light is the most universally reported element across every cultural context. Respondents consistently struggle with language and settle for, it was the light itself. Not light coming from something, just light. The stillness is equally consistent, not the absence of sound. A presence. Something with weight. With fullness. The Sumerians called it the stillness before the first separation, the state before differentiation. People returning from near-death experiences have been trying to describe this same thing for 50 years of formal research. They are using different words for the same place, not because they read the Sumerian tablets, but because they were apparently there. The most uncomfortable element of what the tablets describe is this. Dilmun is not somewhere humans go after they die. The underworld, Kur, is where humans go after they die. That is explicit throughout the Sumerian record. Dilmun is where humans go when the normal rules governing human existence are suspended. Ziusudra goes to Dilmun while still living. Adapa crosses into the divine court while still living. The narrator of CBS 14061 returns. All of them cross while alive. All of them come back changed. And the specific change the tablets describe mirrors, with precise accuracy, what modern Enda research documents as the consistent after effects of the experience. The people who return from NDEs are not changed the way grief changes a person. They are changed structurally. They lose the fear of death. Not philosophically. Neurologically, they report it as a fact about themselves, not a belief they've adopted. They consistently describe an increase in what researchers call other-oriented concern. Less focus on the constructed self, more focus on what remains when everything constructed is stripped away. The Anunnaki fix the eye of death on Inanna. She is stripped of every layer of constructed identity. She dies. She comes back with more power than she had going in. Not the same power. Different power. Something she could only acquire by going through the complete unmaking. Every person who returns from a documented near-death experience describes some version of this. The stripping was not destruction. The stripping was the point. What the Sumerians were building across all of these texts is not a mythology. It is a map. They built cosmological maps the same way they built astronomical maps and land survey maps. They described what had been observed. They described it precisely, in language designed to transmit the description accurately across time. The map of the timeless realm has specific coordinates. Light without source, stillness that is a presence, simultaneous access to all moments, a permanent change in the observer who passes through and returns, and crucially a door. CBS 14061 describes a door, a threshold, a specific point of crossing from the temporal into the timeless. The text doesn't describe this as magical, it describes it as a condition, the condition under which a human being can cross from inside the flow of time to outside it. The Sumerians did not believe this condition was available to everyone, but they believed it was available. They believed human beings had accessed it. They wrote the accounts of those who had accessed it in their most durable material, filed them in their most important archive, and left them for whoever came after, 4,000 years later, in a museum drawer, waiting to be read. There are two things you can do with what this video has described. The first is to file it under ancient mythology and move on. The Sumerians believed in gods and magic and the world being a flat disk floating on water. Why would their description of a timeless realm be more accurate than their cosmology about anything else? This is a reasonable position. It also requires you to explain why their specific, structural, procedural description of the passage of consciousness outside time maps onto modern ND research with the precision that it does. Why 4,000 years ago, a civilization with no neuroscience and no physics described the light without source, the stillness before differentiation, the simultaneous knowing of all moments, and the permanent structural change in the person who returns. Why the Sumerian phrase where I knew all that was, all that is, and all that will be, at one time, is functionally identical to what a firefighter in the United States Air Force described to a clinical researcher in the 20th century. The second thing you can do is sit with the specific details. Dilmun, the shaped returning thing, the place before the counting, the light with no edge, the breath that does not move, the door, the return, the carrying of the shape of what was seen in the structure of how one sees, not in words. The Gidam is not described as something that happens to you. It is described as something you already are, underneath everything. The part that was never made of clay. The Sumerians wrote it on clay because clay survives. It survived 4,000 years in the ruins of Nippur. It survived being catalogued as an anomalous fragment by scholars who couldn't place it. It survived being set aside for decades after Kramer's 1944 translation. It is still there. CBS 14061, University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. A small fragment with clean edges, stored by someone who thought it was worth protecting. The last line of the text, in the most direct translation available, reads, "The place I went still exists. It is not before, it is not after. It is." That is not a comfort. That is not a promise. That is a technical description. The place outside time does not recede into the past when you leave it. It does not depend on your presence to continue existing. It is not a state of mind. It is a location. A location that the oldest civilization we have written records from described in precise operational language. that thousands of people across the following 4,000 years have reported reaching under the specific condition of approaching the boundary of biological death, that we do not yet have a scientific framework adequate to explain. The clay survived. What you do with what is written on it from here is the whole story.